Trash or treasure? Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today, I've got a confession to make. While visiting my brother, I snuck over to his firewood pile and I stole this piece of wood. I think it's black cherry. I'm about 90% sure it's black cherry. And it has some really cool rippled effect in it. It's relatively thin, but I've got this feeling there's something hiding in here. And I think I've got an idea of making something really cool from this piece of, it's not technically trash, but firewood. It has value, of course, for heating and that, but let's face it, if this were thrown on a fire, it's only going to last for a few minutes and then it's gone and you have to throw another piece on it. And all of the beauty of this black cherry would have been lost to that fire. Instead, I think there's some treasure in here. Let's see what we can extract from this piece of regular firewood. I'm going to bring this over to the bandsaw and we're going to get started. I'm going to turn something side grain oriented out of this, so I need to cut out a square section. It's going to leave a lot of material here left over that I could probably make other projects with too. I think this looks pretty good. I love how those ripples appear on the surface. Now I'm going to just use a straight edge here to roughly find the center of this piece. It's important to take the time and find the center of the piece. If you don't, you could be wasting a lot of material. So I'm going to put this between centers. I'm going to use a 4-spur drive center and the tailstock to mount this in place. This also gives me the flexibility to move this around if I need to later. So I'm going to use my 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge to start roughing some of this material away. It's going to curve that whole outside bottom corner. Notice how I have the flute pointing in the direction of the cut. That's really important to do when you're doing a push cut. I'm also tightening up the tailstock as I go too, because the tailstock will loosen up a little bit because as that 4-spur drive center starts working its way into the top of this piece. This wood's relatively hard, so it takes a little bit of time to dig in for that spur. So you want to keep tightening the tailstock, especially when you're starter turning like this. Do me a huge favor, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, click the subscribe button and the bell. That way you'll be notified of any upcoming videos. And we've got tons of videos coming your way and you're not going to want to miss them. So I'm doing a face cut here just to smooth out the bottom. There's still a big divot in there I need to get down below. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to bring this down so that I can get to a nice smooth surface to form the tenon and the shoulder. I like to get that established because once that's established, then we know the bottom of the bowl. We have kind of our point A and then the rim becomes point B, and then we just need to connect those 2 points. Now, I'm just roughing this material today. I'm going to let this equalize. And remember, wood does not dry completely. It will equalize, meaning that based on its environment, the humidity in the location where the wood is and the temperature, the wood will retain a certain amount of moisture. Even in a dry home that's air conditioned or heated, there is still moisture in the air and there will be moisture in the wood. This is true of any wood. If you have a piece of furniture that was made 100 years ago, there's a certain amount of moisture that's in that wood, but it is equalized for your environment. So it's not shifting or moving around because it's equalized at that point. So it's really important that we equalize this. What I'd like to do is a 2-part turning here, meaning I'm going to have 2 pieces of wood, actually 2 different species of wood that are going to fit together. And to assure that this doesn't cause problems over time, I really need to make sure that this wood is equalized. Once it's equalized, it won't warp or deform over time. And that's why we're going to do a twice turning, both for the bowl and for the top portion that's going to be the lid for this piece. So for right now, this is going to be a rough turn first turning, and then we're going to let this set up and dry for a period of time. I'm taking my time here and just making a really nice curve. Even though this is going to be turned again, I really want to establish the shape of this piece so I can see what I'm going to be doing. Kind of helps me visualize what's going to be happening down the road. Now this piece of cherry has been sitting on the wood pile for quite a while, and it's exposed. Both sides were exposed. It was split open. So that means that this has done quite a bit of drying on its own already. So I'm not expecting this piece to shift too much. This is not green wood by any means. Had this been left alone for a couple more months, it probably would just be split away to nothing. But still, it's salvageable at this point. There are some cracks in it, but I kind of don't mind that. You can see the cracks there. And I don't mind that. I kind of like the character that they provide. So with the outside relatively shaped, I'm going to continue flattening the face here. Remember, I have that divot in there, so I need to get below that divot so I have a nice, smooth, flat surface. That's going to create a nub here, and I don't want that nub to cause an issue with the four-jaw chuck. So I'm going to need to get rid of that as well. So it's just something to keep in mind. And this is also a great reason why we have the piece mounted between centers. Now I'm going to use my spindle detail gouge to get in there, and I'm going to cut away this material. I'm going to kind of get in and make the cut as little as or as low as possible. I scored it with the spindle detail gouge. Now I'm just going to use a chisel and my mallet to take that nub off, and then I'll remount that to the lathe. What I want is I want to leave a nice impression with the tailstock. That makes it easy to remount this later. And I don't want that nub to be long like it was. If it were long, it could interfere with the center portion of the four-jaw chuck. Okay, with that mounted back to the lathe, I'm going to clean up the face one more time so I know that's nice and flat. Then I'm going to go ahead and mark the diameter of the tenon using my dividers. Now this is my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. This is what I use for finer detail work and for finishing cuts. So we have the cylinder now for the tenon, and now I'll shape the shoulder as well. This is going to give me extra room to use later. Now with those established, I can continue this curve and refine the curve to pretty much what I'm looking to get out of this final piece, just so I can see again, visualize the way this might appear. What I'm thinking is that I'm going to have a really nice rounded bowl shape that is going to be made with this black cherry. And then I'm going to have a light colored lid that's going to fit inside that bowl. And this is looking pretty good. I'm going to round that off. The shoulder and the tenon give me plenty of material to use for a foot or to do whatever I want with later. I'm going to use a spindle detail gouge to define the angle for the tenon so that it seats well into the four-jaw chuck. My four-jaw chucks are at about a 10 or 11 degree angle. You can kind of visually do it after you've done it a few times. Visually is fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs to be angled enough that the inside corner of those jaws grip it well, and the shoulder seats on top of those jaws. Now I'm clearing away some material here to get started with the inside of this bowl, and I'm really liking the texture from the split wood. So if you remember, the top side of this piece was split, and the texture on the wood surface where it was split is actually really cool because it breaks away naturally, and it also exposes the different grain layers inside the wood. So I really like that. This particular piece of wood seemed to be under pressure. It may have been part of the trunk that was under a large limb that had some weight on it. That's usually where you'll find that quilting or that rippled appearance in the grain. It makes chatoyance where it kind of reflects the light and glimmers a bit. It's very cool to find. It's actually what's called fiddleback as well. It was used on the back of fiddles because it's a really fancy wood. It's not found throughout the entire tree. It's only found in portions of the wood that are under pressure, and the grains have been somewhat crushed or rippled, and that's what gives you that rippled effect. Well, that exposed texture of the wood is on the surface of the top of this bowl. Now, if I turn this away and just turn it down to a regular bowl, that rim's going to be nice and smooth and we'll lose all of that. So instead, I'm going to make this rim quite a bit wider than I normally would, especially for a bowl this small. But I'm going to use that rim as a detail and a decorative feature of this piece. Now keep in mind, this is the first turning, so I'm going to turn this pretty wide. I'm not going to get too crazy with this. I'm going to leave lots of material here. This will also give me time to think about exactly what I want to do with this. Just taking my time and making nice clean cuts here. I'm also wanting to make sure that I'm shaping this inside cut to match the exterior of this bowl so that the curves match. I do that by staying upright and looking at this position. I line my bevel edge up against the initial cut here, making it parallel to the exterior of the bowl. And then I just follow the curve of the exterior, just visually follow that curve down into the bottom of the interior. Just want to parallel the inside to the outside, basically. You can see on the rotation of the rim there, you can see all that wobble going on. There's high spots and low spots, and that's fine. There's just really interesting texture there. When you start these cuts, it's a good idea to rotate the flute of the gouge to almost the closed position or to the right. Remember, we have the nose of the gouge pointing in the direction of the cut at all times. So with this cut going from left to right, if the gouge is rotated over to its side in almost the 3 o'clock position, the flute is angled at the 3 o'clock position, right here, it's a little bit open there, but that's going to prevent there from being any catches or having the tool kick back or get kicked out. And as I progress in the cut, I can turn that more at about a 45-degree angle. And then I want to close it at the end so that I don't rip out those fibers at the end of the cut. There you can see the rim really well. And that's what I want to retain for the final piece. So that's going to do it for this piece for right now. I'm going to let this dry. I'm actually going to run it through the microwave a few times, and then I'm going to give it some time to release any last moisture that might be in it. Now we're going to start with the top portion. This is holly, and I recently did a video where I explained how I processed this tree and all the wood from the tree. You might want to check out that video. Now, unlike the black cherry, this wood is very green, meaning this tree was just cut and it was living. This tree had actually came down during a storm and it was still processing water. So there's a lot of moisture in this wood. So twice turning this is super important, especially if this is going to become a lid for the piece that we're going to be doing here. So this needs to be once turned and then allowed to dry and shift and distort the way that it's going to do. And then it will be trued up again for the final turning. But if we try to make this the final piece now, it'll work for today, but that'll be about it. It's not going to work after that because it's going to start moving and deforming and it won't fit as a lid anymore. So we have to twice turn this. And that's really important to understand, especially when you're doing pieces like this where you have one or two pieces fitting together. Again, I need to remember to keep that tailstock nice and tight. Green wood as well will take a while for that four-jaw or the four-spur drive center to dig in and get a proper grip. And in the meantime, it will slip a little bit. So you need to tighten up the tailstock to make sure that that does not slip. Okay, so I'm cleaning the face of this just a bit. I need to get down, obviously, underneath all of the bark. Now this is holly. This is a very light colored wood. I'm going to part this off because, again, that nub's going to be in the way. So we need to get that out of there. And that's going to give me a nice clean connection to the tailstock. You really want that tailstock to be right up against the base of the bowl. You don't want it to have an extension or a nub there. And again, I'm going to use the dividers to mark the diameter for the tenon. And then I will shape the cylinder that will become the tenon and the shoulder at the same time. It's good practice to do this and get it done because it, again, establishes the bottom of the bowl. And then you know where you need to be working from. You need to work up to the rim at this point. So it makes it really simple. You can see the wobble in the piece because there's high and low spots. This is not turned all the way down yet, and there's bark in there too. You can see that darker area. Still a little bit of bark in there. This is very wet wood, but it's also really pretty wood. It's very light colored. This is my 1/2-inch spindle detail gouge. You can tell when the wood's really wet, it makes these long ribbons of shavings. You can see those coming off the flute there, and you can see them building up. It's almost like turning a bar of soap. It's really fun to turn very green wood like this. What's happening is all of those wood fibers are binding together with the moisture, and the moisture keeps them intact. When the wood dries out, they become shorter curls, almost to the point of dust. If you have a really dry piece, and they don't come out very long, so they get a really, really short shavings that come off the piece. Okay, so that's going to be a pretty good rough shape for what I'm going to be doing in the future with the rim. When I say future, I'm saying future because there's going to be some time that goes by. I can't deal with this right now, and I'm not going to be able to run this through the microwave a whole bunch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run it through the microwave a few times. That's going to inspire the wood to dry and start releasing some of its moisture. But then I'm just going to let it sit, and I'm going to let it do its thing over time. Now, if you want to learn how to deal with green wood and how to manage green wood and understand all the ins and outs and what's important, you might want to check out my Tree to Bowl Understanding Green Wood course. In that course, we go over all the details of everything you need to know to process raw wood, whether you're just dealing with a couple logs that maybe somebody gives you, or if you're processing an entire tree. We go into all the detail that you'll need to know for getting the most out of the wood that you have available around you. And there's nothing more satisfying than being able to salvage a tree that would otherwise go to waste or be burned up as firewood and create something with it. Again, I'm going to make sure that this wall is evenly thick throughout. What I mean by that is I don't want the walls up, say, along the rim to be thinner than they are at the bottom. If the bottom's really thick and the walls are thin, then this is going to dry unevenly, and you've got a really good chance of it cracking severely if that's the case. So you don't want that to happen. Again, those shavings are just coming out amazingly clean and long because of the moisture content in this wood. Okay, so this is rough turned at this point. I've got the two pieces, potentially a lid and a bottom portion. Now we're just going to give this some time. We're going to give this half a year. That's what it ended up being. Kind of set this aside and forgot about it. The cherry piece looks about the same. It didn't move too much. The holly has changed dramatically. Look at the shape of the tenon. It's an oval now. It's no longer round. So we need to true that up. And we need to go and make the final turning for both of these pieces to see what we come up with. Okay, before I get started, I'm going to sharpen my tools. It's always a good idea to have sharp tools. You really want to sharpen at the beginning of your turning, during your turning, whenever your tools start to feel like they're lacking a little bit. And then especially right at your last finishing cuts, you want to sharpen again so you get nice clean cuts every time. That's going to make it a lot easier. You'll have a lot less sanding to do if you're making those last few passes with a very sharp tool. I've got an online tool sharpening course that goes over everything you need to know to sharpen your tools, but it also goes over everything you need to learn how to shape your tools. One of the big questions I get a lot is, where can I buy a 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge? Well, as far as I know, there's no place that sells them like this. But guess what? You can buy a regular bowl gouge and shape it this way all by yourself. And in my tool sharpening course, I go over all the details of how to do that. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm going to grind away the heel on these gouges. Because these pieces are relatively small and I need to turn tight corners, I want that bevel to be a little shorter. If I use the full length of the bevel, it's going to leave burnish marks in the sides of the bowl. So you'll get these little lines in the bottom of the bowl. You may be making a perfect cut. You might be riding the bevel fine. But if that heel's dragging behind your cut, it can burnish lines in your piece, and we don't want that. So by grinding down the heel like this, this reduces the size of the bevel, and it makes this tool turn a tighter radius, especially for the inside turning portion. And you can see I'm doing this by hand. I'm essentially making a letter U shape while I'm grinding that away. I'm going to check the speed here on the lathe, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. I need to get down through the high spots of this rim. I know I want to keep this rim here, but I need to get through those high spots, and I need to create a ledge that a lid could seat into. Now this gouge works pretty well, but I need to make a really nice clean 90-degree cut that's going to leave a straight side and a flat bottom. So I'm using my 1/2-inch 55-degree bevel bowl gouge at first, but then I'm going to come in with a square nose scraper. Yep, a carbide scraper. There are times when they work really handy. So this is doing two things at the same time. It's giving me a nice clean side wall that's 90 degrees, and it's flushing up the inside rim and making it nice and flat. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my 1/2-inch 55-degree bevel swept back and start removing the interior of the bowl. If I leave the inside shape of this bowl where the rim is right now and just do a half circle or half sphere inside there, this is going to appear really thick and bulky. So instead, what I want to do is I want to undercut that rim. I want to get underneath that and cut so that the inside is wider and bigger than you might initially think when you see this piece. I'm going to clean up the edge of that rim, and I'm going to go in wide. Now, one of the things I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a scraping cut. I'm using the lower wing here. This is a delicate move. You want to take your time doing this. You don't want to be trying to remove a lot of material at once. But you can see what I was doing is I was scraping away some of the inside underneath that rim. And now I've turned the bowl gouge over. Here I'm going to scrape away some more. You can see how I'm getting in there and getting under that rim. That allows me to get underneath that rim a lot better. Then I'm making a regular push cut then from that location. Then I'll remove some more material and continue building that wall down to the bottom. With all these pieces, you really want to take your time. You don't want to get too aggressive and make deep, thick cuts. You just make light cuts, make each pass count, make sure your tool's exactly where you want it to be, and then proceed. Now, I don't really need to keep the mass of the center of this because the sidewalls on this is really thick. I doubt that there's much vibration going on in the walls. That's typically why I work down the walls first, so that I know that number one, I'm getting the wall thickness the way I like it. And by leaving the center mass in there, it leaves some stability. Now, that's a big factor if you're turning green wood and or if you're turning thin-walled bowls. If you're turning thin-walled bowls, that center mass can be a great support for you as you turn. But as soon as that center mass is gone, the top rim flexes a lot, and you do not want to return and cut that anymore. Now, that's not going to be much of a factor here because the walls in this are pretty thick, and I don't think there's going to be much flexing. You can see how I'm getting in there and I'm cutting underneath that rim. That's going to give this inside cavity a much larger space, and it's going to appear wider than would be expected. Now, I'm going to actually use my round nose scraper here. There are some tool marks in there, and I'm putting the scraper up on its edge. I'm angling this to the side, and if you watch, there's shavings that are coming off in ribbons. How is that happening? Well, believe it or not, instead of scraping, I'm actually cutting. What's happening here is there's a burr on the front edge of that tool. The burr is essentially the material of the metal. When you sharpen both the top and bottom, this is a negative rake scraper, so there's a top edge that's been sharpened at about a 15-degree angle, and the bottom edge come up and meet. When they come up to meet, the metal gets really thin right where they meet, and that's actually what a cutting edge is that thin edge there. And that's essentially a burr, meaning that it can get flexible. It can be really thin and it can be flexible. Basically, if you think of a kitchen knife, you think of a chef, they're always using a burnishing tool to basically straighten the burr on their knife. When you straighten the burr on a knife by running it through a sharpening stick or a burnishing stick, what that's doing is just taking that thin piece of metal and straightening it up again so it cuts well. Well, we can take that edge of metal on a scraper, like the round nose scraper, and you can run a burnishing tool, or you can use like a screwdriver, and you can pull that across it once, and you're going to curve that burr upward. And if you curve it upward, you're essentially creating a cutting edge that is cutting instead of scraping. So I've got an article on my website all about how to scrape with a round nose scraper and how to form that burr. So you might want to check that out. Go to turnawoodbowl.com and then go up into the search window and search round nose scraper, and you'll see the article that goes into great detail about that. Okay, I've got a piece of scrap wood here. This is actually camphor, which smells incredibly good. It smells like Vicks Vapor Rub. So my whole shop is smelling right now. I'm not smelling it yet because I've got my respirator on, but as soon as you take that respirator off, it wakes you up really quick. So what I'm doing is I'm making a custom jam chuck to hold the shape of the bowl and hold the bowl in place so that I can clear off the bottom portion of this. I've used the dividers to take measurements from the bowl and transfer those to the jam chuck until I get this to just fit. You want to get it as close as possible and then just make minor adjustments like this until it slides on and fits. it's close, take your time and just gradually work up to it. I'm using the spindle detail gouge there to make sure that I have a nice 90-degree corner to match the inside corner of the bowl. All right, that matches, but I have this higher spot right here that's bumping up there, so I need to clear away a little more material on the jam chuck. The jam chucks are the way to go because they're obviously very inexpensive. It's just a piece of scrap wood, and they're completely customizable. There we go. That's a nice snug fit. It's not snapping on, but that's fine. I'm going to bring the tailstock up, and that's why it's so important to have that nice mark from the tailstock initially. Now, for this piece, I've decided I am not going to leave a foot on this. We're going to make this one continuous curve, very similar to the calabash bowl you might have seen me turn in a previous video. If you haven't seen me turn the calabash bowl, you're going to want to check that video out. So like a calabash bowl, this bowl will have no foot. It's just going to be one continuous curve. And here you can see why it's so important to have that extra material for the tenon and the shoulder. That's going to afford me enough space that I can clear this out. Now there's a little pin in the end of this tailstock. If I were close to the bottom of this curve, that little pin would leave a hole or a dimple in the bottom of the bowl, and we wouldn't have a continuous piece of wood. We would have a little mark there, and we obviously wouldn't want that. But you can see right here how much material was used for the tenon and the shoulder. Now I'm using a shear scrape here just to blend the bottom curve and to smooth out that curved shape of the bowl. I want a nice fluid curve that goes all the way around this piece. Don't want any flat spots. I still need to do some shaping there, but I'm going to get in here and sand this transition area. I'm going to go through all the grits. I'm starting at 180, going to 220, and then to 320 and 400. Now I'm going to use gaffer's tape. Gaffer's tape is a very strong holding tape that leaves very little residue after the fact. And what I'm going to do is tape this in position onto the jam chuck. And I'm using a lot of tension to keep this down tight so that it doesn't come loose. I'm going to depend on that tape 100% here in just a moment. I'm going to use my spindle detail gouge and reduce the size of that nub. Just take your time here. Now I'm watching the total curve of this piece too, and I'm making sure that I'm not leaving a high spot. I'm not making a divot here. I want to make sure that it flows continuously and is a nice fluid curve. So I can tailstock. I'm kind of leaving it there just to make sure that this is going to hold. And then I'm going to have to get it out of the way here because it's going to be in my way. If this piece were to break free right now, the tailstock would somewhat catch it. It'd still probably bounce around and cause some damage, but it's holding on pretty well. So now we obviously want to make very light cuts here. Just going to take my time and switch tools and went from the spindle detail gouge to my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back. I'm doing a push cut that goes towards the jam chuck. That's going to help keep the piece on the jam chuck. And the cuts are very light. We don't want to do anything aggressive here because we only have a light hold on with that tape. So I'm making a really light shear scrape, blending in that curve. And then I'm going to sand this. And again, I'll go through all the grits with this so that it's nice and smooth and matches the rest of the shape. But there you can see that nice curve as this piece goes around. Now remember, you don't want to go across that center because with the sander on and the lathe going, you can do it with the lathe off. If you do that with the lathe on, you're basically going to be sanding in 2 spots and you're going to make a valley in there, and you don't want that. All right, so we can take the tape off. The bottom portion of the bowl is done, and I'm really happy with that. So I'm going to use the same jam chuck, and I'm going to keep shaping that to hold the piece of holly that's going to become the lid for this piece. It's not quite seating there, so I want to shape it a little bit better. Again, that's why these jam chucks are so nice. You can just quickly shape however you need and get the piece seated there properly. All right, that's better. And then I'm going to pull the tailstock up and match that pin from the previous time the tailstock was there. Look at that wobble. Okay, so I'm going to try to true up the side of this tenon. And I think it's going to make the piece too small. Yeah, I need it to be that wide, so the tenon is no longer usable. So that's a good indication that for future green wood turnings with holly, I need to make the tenon larger than necessary so that when it shrinks and turns into that oval, there's enough material left that I can still make a decent tenon. So luckily this has been turned thick enough. There's our tenon size. Luckily this has been turned thick enough that I can still make a tenon. I just need to make sure that I'm not getting too aggressive or too deep here because we don't want to waste all this material and go through it. But with a small piece like this, I don't need much of a tenon to grip the 4-jaw chuck. So there's our tenon and shoulder. And now I'm going to clean up that. I'm narrowing down the nub here. I think I forgot where I was because I still need to shape the outside of this piece. And by narrowing down this nub, it's actually going to make it a little bit risky that this could come loose, but that'll be okay. I was kind of thinking about some other things at the moment. That's why you want to stay focused while you're turning. It's also another reason why when you turn a piece like this where you have multiple connections and multiple pieces, you really need to be thinking about what your next move is going to be. And if your thought wanders off to something else, you can easily do something like I just did, which is to turn that nub down. But there's still enough nub that it's holding on and it doesn't seem to be that much of an issue. So I'm using a pull cut here to shape the exterior of this piece. I'm going to have this curve and be the outside of the lid. So you're seeing the outside portion of the lid right now. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the bottom portion. There will be no foot. This foot or the tenon and the shoulder will be completely removed for the final piece. So here I'm using a really gentle shear scrape to clean up the material, make it nice and smooth. If you want to learn more about the shear scrape, I've got a video all about the shear scrape. It is the best way to really refine the surface without getting aggressive. You can see how thin those shavings are coming off. Now this piece distorted dramatically from the green wood condition that it was in before to where it is now. All right, so the exterior is shaped. I'm going to go ahead and angle the dovetail for the 4-jaw chuck, and then I'm going to remove this nub. All right, now we can flip this around and get it mounted to the chuck. You can see how much distortion occurred. Look at how high the pith area is on the sides of this piece. I'm going to take my time, make really light cuts here to remove those high spots and level out the material here. You can also see that wobble on the inside because it's not a circle that's turning inside there, it's an oval. Now what I need to do is make sure that I have this sized correctly for the inside of the bottom portion. And it's really close. Then I'm also going to mark the inside rim so we know where this will seat down inside the rim as well. Again, very light passes here. We do not want to get aggressive. We're just basically making a really thin lip that will seat down inside that bowl. Now, because we have the first portion of this, or the bottom of the bowl, done, we can have that handy and we can fit it up to this piece and see how well it seats. Okay, that's looking pretty good. There you can also see the texture of that rim. All right, there's a little transition area here. I could shear scrape that. I'm going to go through the grits, and I'm actually just going to let the sandpaper take and make that transition around the side. Now I need to clear away the material inside the bottom of the lid. This is my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. Also remember, when I use the 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, that's what I prefer to use. It doesn't mean that it's right or it's wrong. You could use any angle you would like. There's lots of people that do different things. There's some people who use a 45-degree angle or a 50-degree angle. Some people do the 40-40 grind. Anything that you're using that works for you is totally fine. This is what I've found that works well for me. You can see those tool marks in there. I'm going to clear those away with the shear scrape. But you can also see how I'm making those ribbons with this scraper. And again, that's the burr that I mentioned earlier. You really want to check out that article so you understand how this burr works. Okay, the lid is looking great. I'm going to put the jam chuck back on, and guess what? We're going to customize it yet again. The versatile jam chuck. I'm going to take this down and I'm going to make this so that the lid will fit on it pretty snugly. All right, that's roughly about it. Now I measured the shape of the inside, or the inside portion of this, so trying to figure out exactly what shape I need to make here for that lid to snap onto. Not quite there. And that's kind of what you want. You don't want it to, you're not going to make it fit the first time. You want it to be a little bit big, and then you slowly bring the material down until it fits. And remember, when you're cutting this, you're cutting away material on both sides. So when you cut away a very small amount, you're cutting away twice of that when you're trying to fit a piece on like this. There we go. That's going to fit really well. So I'm going to take some of the side material away so that I have some space to tape this on. I'm going to use the same technique of taping this to the jam chuck at the very end. Get it nice and snug, it'll seat perfectly there. I'm going to bring the tailstock up and make sure it's centered and press it into the jam chuck evenly. And I'm going to use that same push cut into the headstock to remove the tenon and the shoulder. You can see I'm keeping it a little bit proud there until it blends in the total curve. Just gently take away. That's what's so nice about the shear scrape, is it allows you to do such fine tuning of the surface. Now I'm keeping an eye on the overall curve of the entire piece. I want this to look like one fluid curve from one side to the other. I don't want there to be any flat spots or any corners visible. That's looking really good. And I'll switch over to my spindle detail gouge to work this little nub down. Before we go any farther, I need to get that tape on to hold this in place. Can use quite a bit of tension to hold this in. And then make really light cuts to remove that nub. I'm just lightly going to sand that. I need to stop the lathe and then sand that smooth. Nice. Okay, now I need to mount a handle on top of this lid. So I'm going to drill a small 3/16 of an inch hole in the top of this lid. I do not want this to go through. It's going to go very slowly. It's going to go about 1/8 of an inch deep, and that's it. Now I have this scrap piece of cherry from the wood that's split apart, and I really like the shape of it and the texture. So I'm going to drill a small hole here. Again, this is 3/16 of an inch. And then I'm going to take this piece over to the sander and I'm going to start shaping that a bit. I'm going to take the rough edges off and I'm going to shape that. Now what I'm going for here is I want there to be contrast. All good design has contrast. And a really good piece has multiple contrasts in it. And this one qualifies for that because we have the nice dark wood of the cherry contrasting the light wood of the holly. And then we also have this rough texture that's on the rim of the bowl and it's going to be on the handle of the bowl, contrasted by the nice smooth roundness of the lid and the bottom portion of the bowl. Whenever you can put contrast into a piece, you're going to make it much more interesting. For whatever reason, we humans are drawn to contrast and it attracts our attention and we find it pleasing. We find it in everything. It's found in food even. Think about it. You have crunchy and soft food. You have sweet and sour. Contrast is very important. So this handle is really going to contrast the overall shape of the lid, which is round and smooth. This is jagged and natural and organic. So I'm taking my time. I'm going to round this off a little bit more, smooth it out, and then I'm going to hand sand this as well. Just going to take a little bit of sandpaper here and knock off any sharp edges. We obviously don't want to get splinters in that, but we also don't want it to be perfectly smooth and dimensional. We want it to have an organic feel to it. So I'm going to use a little glue and I'm going to apply that and I'm going to use a 3/16 inch dowel and get that seated and I'll wipe off the excess glue. Now I got to figure out the depth of this. So I'm using the lead of this. Basically that cone depth of the lead is all of that depth of that hole is. So this should seat just perfectly in there. Carefully. This is a Japanese pole saw that's great, really fine tooth saw. It's really nice for a small piece like this. So I'm going to glue up the handle and I'm going to go ahead and get that placed inside the lid. And I'm going to pop that off the jam chuck. And there's our piece. I love it. But you know what? As I'm turning it and holding it towards the camera, I'm also liking the way it looks at this angle. What if we mark this? I'm using the ways of the lathe, or the rails of the lathe, to mark how that was seated. And then I'm going to try to find the center of that location right there. And I'm going to get my sanding disc out. Now, I have a video about how you can make this sanding disc. It's super cool, very simple, a great tool to add to your lathe. And now I'm going to use that to create the foot for this bowl. This is not going to have a calabash bottom on this, so it just sits like a normal bowl. It's going to have a flat side angled so that it seats at an angle. Check that out. All right, I'm going to apply mineral oil to this piece. Now, with all the rough edges in that, I really want to apply something that's going to get down into those crevices, and mineral oil is great for that, and it won't build up very easily. So I'm going to take my time and rub it around all the surfaces. Now, I'll come back also later and I'll probably apply multiple coats, but I want this to set up. The other nice thing about mineral oil is you could just basically pour it right in there so it gets down into those crevices really nice. This wood is relatively dry. It's soaking it up quite quickly. And it brings out the color very nice, and it's just an overall really great solution for this particular application. I'm going to get it down into those broken edges as well. Try not to waste. Just wiping it into all of the dry spots. Now we'll get the lid as well. Love the red of the cherry. The color comes out so nicely. I'll put a link to the mineral oil in the description below this video. You can check that out. Also, you can go to my website, turnawoodbowl.com/gear. And over there, you'll see all the material that I recommend, all the tools, equipment, and finish material that I use. So I'm going to work this in nice and evenly. And look at this. I love the angles on it. I love the color, the contrast. I love the way this looks. And to have this beautiful piece on display is just gorgeous. Who would have thought from a piece of firewood you would get something this beautiful? Look at those textures. Okay, be honest with me. When you saw me holding that chunk of firewood at the beginning of this video, did you think we would come up with something like this? Yeah, I didn't think it turned out this good. Now, I had an idea what I was going to do with it, and I kind of envisioned this. I really liked the rough exposed texture of the split wood. I didn't want to smooth all that off and just make it ordinary and smooth. Instead, I wanted to expose and showcase that texture. And also, if you look, there's quilting or pressure that was put down on this particular chunk of wood that pushed those grains down. That's what makes those those wavy lines that you see. If you see it in the light just right, there's like kind of a chatoyance or a shimmer to it. And it's really cool, and I liked having that exposed. Now, this piece really showcases how you can use contrast to make a bowl interesting. I'm using the darker black cherry wood contrasted with the light holly wood. We're also contrasting the texture. So we have that rough exposed texture on this rim and on the handle, contrasting with the nice smooth round lid and the round shape of the back of this piece. Now, we see bowls like this a lot, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's kind of cool to be able to put the base up on its side and showcase this. So this can be sitting on a table and it's tilted up, so you see the lid, you see the handle, you see this nice textured edge, and I gotta tell you, I just love this piece. It's really, really simple. The mineral oil has worked really well with this. It still needs to be rubbed in a little bit more, and I'll probably put another coat after this cures, but it works really well, and it gets into all those little crevices. Now keep in mind too, there's cracks on this piece, and those were the natural occurring cracks when this wood was drying on its own on that wood pile. And I don't have a problem with them. This piece is equalized now, meaning that it has balanced with the air around it, so it's not going to move much at all. So I don't mind seeing these. It's kind of part of that organic look to it, and it's nature. That's how this piece was going to break itself apart and continue drying and splitting open, making it great for firewood. Now, I'm really happy I was able to find this on my brother's wood pile. So let me know, leave me a comment below. Let me know if this has inspired you to want to go out to your wood pile, or maybe find somebody else's wood pile and discover a piece or two of wood that can be turned into something really cool. Now, this is a pretty good sized piece, and I could have made 2 or 3 of those from that log as well. So it's kind of surprising what you can get out of just a little chunk of firewood. So keep that in mind. I hope this has inspired you to want to get out there and use whatever you can find to turn something really interesting with. If you like this video, do me a huge favor and click that like button. Thank you. Also, subscribe if you're not already subscribing. Check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got everything you want to know about turning wood bowls, and I have courses that will quickly help you accelerate your wood bowl turning skills. So check it out, turnawoodbowl.com. All right, guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy turning.